so I'm not expecting the call that way. But I thought I'd take the opportunity, kind of talk about what the what I think might happen and what a good policy might look like and what that might mean for the Abbey Line. So I've got a few thoughts on that. And I'm going to talk a bit about how that relates to wider planning policy. And I'm also going to talk a bit about Cornwall. The reason I want to talk a bit about Cornwall is they've got branch lines, which used to be single track and have quite a poor service. And they've been putting in passing loops and upgrading the service. And I thought it would be quite interesting as a rural county, though I don't think there's any more powers in Hertfordshire, just to do a little bit on that. So I'll talk a bit about that. Yes, that's me. So I'm a professor at the University of Hertfordshire, which has a smart mobility unit, which does work on transport policy, particularly outside cities, which apparently very few people have done research on. And I'm a consultant in transport policy. And as Sandy said, I ran a campaign for transport for 30 years. And I've been a resident in St Albans for longer than that. So that's me. This bit about transport outside cities. So actually, if you look at the transport policy discussion, all about cities, about what happens in London or Birmingham or smaller cities like Cambridge and Oxford, and that's all very well, but the places out there need attention. And I've said this here that they've got counties like Hertfordshire have high car ownership, severe traffic congestion. It doesn't have large settlements. What is the biggest settlement in Hertfordshire? They're edge of city regions. Hertfordshire isn't the only place like this. You could go to other cities, places like Warwickshire, Cheshire. They're all rather similar, but nobody's really looked at these. And they have relatively poor public transport, especially orbital. I know there are now more express buses and so on when they run. But there's also substantial planned house building, or some of it actual house building. Some of it's turned up along the Abbey Line. But I think Howard Station was built because there was a housing development there. So, and we've been running round tables just to develop a research and policy agenda. And we've now been running more with Transport East, which is a subnational transport body as a rural transport learning network. So I'm just going to talk a bit about that. And yes, it's the Smart Mobility Unit, which does various things. And we do research, and of course, the University of Hertfordshire does run Uno, which isn't a perfect bus company, but it does run some buses sometimes. Sorry?
They don't lack.
I'd like to hear it.
They're more expensive chatting.
Yeah, but and some of them are about to go electric as well. Because they've got some money off of that. So that's what the unit does. And I think a starting point for thinking about sustainable travel is that actually, leaving aside, I'm going to talk about some of the global issues in a minute, but actually, in this area, getting about can be quite annoying because there's quite a lot of traffic jams and the bus is confusing and it's difficult to know where they run to and from and they cost a lot and they mostly disappear after 7 p.m, even new ones. And the Abbey Line is very quick and the CRP is doing great work in promoting it, but it is infrequent and, as we've just been hearing, unreliable. And cycling feels dangerous because there are protected routes and a lot of people walk. The main roads are sometimes difficult to cross. Try getting from this theatre to the Abbey Station, for instance, and the pavements aren't maintained properly. And there's quite a lot of new housing development that's quite car dependent, car based, and that makes it all rather dependent, and that creates wider problems of air pollution from vehicles, which we now know is what the impacts are wider and worse, literally from the womb to old age. Air pollution from vehicles affects health. And there's also less physical activity, road traffic dominating streets and landscapes, and the road casualties and social exclusion. And above all, there is climate change, which adds urgency to those graphs are known to a lot of people. But transport is in the firing line because it's overtaken energy. It's now the largest emitting sector in the UK, and hasn't changed very much because we've seen large-scale reductions from power generation and, if anything, an increase in CO2 emissions from transport. And if you look at the bottom right, that's a government source 2022 figures, 2021 figures. Transport accounts for 31%, 25%, depending on how you cut it and what you include of UK carbon dioxide emissions. So it's a big problem. Now, actually, there's quite a lot of data around about the impacts of transport patterns in Hertfordshire. There's quite a lot of open data now. So in 2022, this is Hertfordshire County Council data, 42% of trips in Hertfordshire were made by car drivers, 90% by car passengers, 26.5% on foot. Actually, that's been an increase since COVID as well. There's been more walking, apparently. Public transport, 9%. So there's public transport is all overall across the county quite a small proportion of total trips, though actually for longer distance trips it will be greater. But you can find quite a lot of other data. So on air pollution, this is a Harpen and High Street number, which I did for a report that I did for the Harpen Society last year. You can just find an air quality report for your address. So Harpen and High Street, as an example, exceeds 2 World Health Organization limits and is in the 68th percentile nationally. So in other words, it's two-thirds most polluting area. So that's an example of a Hertfordshire street. But you could find that in, say, Peaham Junction, it's notoriously bad here. Road casualties in 2019, Hertfordshire went down, serious casualties went up. I found more recent figures for that. You can find some carbon emission numbers. They're higher than the national average. Some areas are very high in Hertfordshire. And you can also find carbon emissions from commuting, which in St Albans are about the national average, but elsewhere they're actually much larger. So there's quite a lot of data out there about local impacts, and I don't know, the CLP might want to delve into some of that data and see whether it wants to make use of that in promoting sustainability. So in summary, I found this nice picture of St Peter Street in about 1950. Travel around Hertfordshire is dominated by car travel, but there is a lot of walking, which now that leads to a lot of congestion. There is enough space for all the traffic, and sat-navs, etc., puts traffic into side roads. And there have been changes in travel pattern. I think the numbers that Kate showed from your survey have mirrored nationally. There's less commuting generally, by all modes actually, by car as well, and more leisure travel. So actually, car travel since COVID nationally, and I think in Hertfordshire as well, is still at weekdays underneath COVID levels, but at weekends it's much higher, and that's true of rail as well. Is back in many cases to pre-COVID levels at weekends, not during the week. So it's quite interesting. But in general, the point I was making was the travel patterns are unsustainable. There isn't space for more cars and vans in many streets, and there's carbon emissions, and air pollution too. Now, the good news from the work that the university is that there are options for tackling those. It is possible to have good public transport even outside cities. I got into doing, I was quite keen to do some stuff on transport outside cities because I kept seeing articles in papers about, whenever you have articles in all sorts of papers, websites about transport and the need to do something about transport, carbon, brown, whatever, you get all these below the line comments. Interestingly, they were as strong, there were as many below the line comments saying this kind of stuff in places like the Guardian States as there were in the Telegraph and the Mail. And all the comments below the line say, it's all very well, people living in London, they don't have to use cars, but outside big cities, there's no alternative but driving big SUVs everywhere. And I thought, that can't be right. So we've been looking at things, and I'll say a bit about some of the things we found. But, it is possible to have good public transport even outside cities. And active travel can be a real option, travel outside cities. And there's new technology that can bring new travel options, and new housing doesn't have to be car-based. And I'll talk a bit about those. That's a housing, the bottom left is a housing development near Leicester, which has a demand-responsive bus feeding into Leicester railway station. Starts at 6 in the morning, finishes at 11 at night, 7 days a week. it can be done. And I'll talk a bit about Cornwall and the commuter census as well. So let's have some principles for better transport, for what might be something an incoming government might do. I'm not saying any new government or any government will do this, but I think principle, let's start by actually improving public transport, which means making trains and buses better, cheaper, more accessible and linked together. So the bus stop if there is a bus stopping at Park Street Station is actually signposted, for example. And I think actually, and improving active travel so that walking and cycling are real options for shorter journeys, better linked to public transport, including better and less cluttered pavements. And I think some of that is simply about planning it and believing that some people will actually use it, because sometimes you can see that the people doing the planning and thinking about either public transport or active travel have gone there in their cars and designed something and driven away again. And it's something that nobody will actually use at all. I think it's also about thinking about transport as networks rather than routes, so that you don't plan the Abbey Line. You think, what about how does the Abbey Line or journeys on it fit into wider networks? Where are people going? Whether that's to and from railway stations, whether it's to other railway lines, other places. So it is about having a belief that actually people will use this stuff if they do it. It's just worth saying that we've reopened railway lines, as you mentioned, once just happened. There's been almost universally reopened railway lines and stations at Thornport House. So there's, I think somebody told me that there's a new station, Worcestershire Parkway, which is on where the lines Worcester cross, and that's on what was projected 3 years after opening. That's on year 12. What was projected. So the Oakhampton line, which I'll talk a bit about, is now way over what it was projected to have. So I think there's a thing about just believing that the stuff works. Just to give you an example of how not to do any of this, there was going to be a big housing development on the Fort Dagenham site in East London, several thousand houses from a government, being promoted by something that all parties said they'd want to make happen. We want lots of housing development to happen. And there's going to be a new station on the London Southend line, service, and that was signed off. It was in franchise for Southend CBC Railway, and it was in GLA and TfL plans to serve buses, and so on. And at the last minute, something in the DfT, an economist, went, actually, we know evidence people are going to use this. We think it will abstract from surrounding stations. And on our benefit cost ratio, it will cost lots of money because delay existing users by 30 seconds. So this will cost, this will be a cost. And so we want everybody involved, other than us, to guarantee that this station won't actually result in losses. And of course, nobody got that in their plans. So the station hasn't happened and the development hasn't happened. And that's an example of just not believing that in a development of 3,000 homes, some people will actually not believing that they will actually use trains at all and that everybody will drive. So there is a thing about just believing, actually looking at the evidence, which is that we do provide good public transport and active travel, people actually use it. There's some other things you can do as well, though, around this. And one of that is working with travel generators, the employers, schools, leisure providers, developers, to improve alternatives to car use. So that, and I'll say a bit about, there's some examples in there's some examples in Hertfordshire of employees that do this. But yeah, there are ways of doing that. And you could imagine that, for example, the Berkeley Group might have been asked to contribute to upgrades to the Abbey Line, but also to the welcome pack could actually be part of a wider travel plan. There's car-based development, which I'm going to say a bit more about, and also more powers and funding for local transport. Some of that is indeed talked about in various manifestos. So I think those are some of the principles. They're not the only ones, and I think alongside that, I mentioned less car-based development. Some of this is about joining transport up with wider issues, concerns. Actually, I was at dinner not long ago, and somebody seen in transport was bemoaning the fact that their economists and analysts are very pure, but they make the public transport lose all the vital arguments because they don't talk about they don't in their analysis say how their policies help or interventions help health or industrial policy or anything like that. And so what a principle is actually to link to wider objectives, policies and strategies. So what might all that mean for a better Abbey Line? So as I've said, the CRP has done really good things, marketing line, improving facilities on it, but the line should be enhanced. So if you think about the Brickwood passing, that would allow a half-hour service. Now, I mentioned Cornwall. So Cornwall County Council, it's a unitary council, so it's not like Hertfordshire directly, but it doesn't have any more transport powers than Hertfordshire does, and it's managed to get a passing loop on the Falmouth branch, which was installed in 2009, which allows for a half-hour service, more than doubling the service. And you could see there how they did it. They brought back another platform, and they also, they actually advanced so that the trains don't actually use that other platform. What they do is they lengthen the platform so that the trains pass each other, and they've just got a longer platform with two trains at it, and then they pass each other. So you didn't actually even need an extra platform. They just lengthen the existing one and put a passing loop. Fine. So that's one. And now, as part of what they call the Mid Cornwall Metro, the Newquay branch is getting a passing loop too, and that's going to mean an hourly service as opposed to 5 trains a day, I think it is. And Newquay is getting so there's the Mid Cornwall Metro. There's new platform at Newquay, which is, you see at the bottom, there's one platform at the moment. You can see the train in the distance. There's a platform on the left which is disused. That's going to be brought back into use. Upgrades to level crossings, new axle counter track sections to allow that to happen. 90 new signals as part of a resignaling programme, and it's part of a wider programme, which I'll talk a bit about in a minute, of what Cornwall Council is up to. So I just thought I'd mention this because I think it's sort of directly comparable to the Abbey Line. It's a branch line. It's got Falmouth, Newquay, where places, big places, which haven't had a brilliant rail service, and now they're getting, or in Falmouth's case, they have one. And the Mid Cornwall Metro joins that up, so there'll be an hourly service, I think, from Newquay to Parr to Truro to Falmouth. So it'll join these up and intersperse with more local trains as well. So that's the. I just thought I'd mention that because that's an example. And then there's some other things that you might think in a world of sustainable travel where you're believing public transport might work. You could have accessibility. I noticed your comments about St Albans Abbey Station, and for various reasons. I had a presentation from Great Anglia the other day. They've just installed new trains on their entire network, and they've taken the opportunity to make more completely accessible. So they're accessible inside, so once you get in there on steps, but they're also, you can see that picture in the top left, you can see somebody getting in, and there's a little platform that's come out, a little ramp that's come out, and it's sort of, it's a retractable platform that comes out. And they've been able to adjust the platform stations a bit so that 75% of the stations are now fully completely accessible on the entire Greater Anglia network. Again, that includes some pretty rural branch lines, East Anglia. They've still got routes, but they've made it so that it's easier for those ramps to work. So it's become a much more accessible network, and that's all the trains that run across the whole of East Anglia. Not all, because there are some other operators, but the ones running out of Hertfordshire Street, run by Great Anglia, are all completely accessible. And I should say, by the way, that the same manufacturers make new trains for the Merseyrail network. Again, completely accessible, retractable ramps. And Merseyrail have done a lot more work on the stations, so they're now completely, a lot of them are completely accessible from train platform. And they've done this, and they're also making trains for the Tottenham and Metro as well. So it's possible to provide much more accessibility. And in thinking about this as rather than just next year, this is something that's possible. And then you can think about area-wide ticketing for rail, bus, and other transport. Again, as I say, Cornwall's been doing that. And then there's the thing about thinking about stations as hubs or gateways for the surrounding communities with good active travel links, bus links. That's the bus links that serves Oakhampton Station. Will soon serve a sort of Oakhampton Parkway outside, which will provide better links between Oakhampton in Devon, this is, and the surrounding area that lost a lot of its rail services in the 1960s. Cycle parking stations and so on. And this concept of stations as hubs and gateways is something I know the rail network promote significantly, but it's clearly possible. I put all this up just to show really it's good practice, and I know the underlines of some of this, but I think there's opportunities to think about this in the context of what you might do if you were thinking about the Abbey Line as part of a wider sustainable travel network. I didn't put this in, but there's clearly other options for the Abbey